The Blue Jackets no longer have a second first-round pick, but they do have 34th overall in the draft. Could Ethan Gauthier be a player that they choose there? We're talking to Sebastian High about that on today's Locked On Blue Jackets.
You're Locked On Blue Jackets, your daily podcast on the Columbus Blue Jackets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Blue Jackets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am, as always, your host, Jay Foster, here to bring you the good, the bad, and the ugly about your favorite team and mine, the Columbus Blue Jackets. No Hayden today. We are going to be going with an old episode that I recorded early last week, with Sebastian High, where we talked all about Ethan Gauthier. At the time, we did talk about his potential as a pick at 22nd overall. Blue Jackets obviously do not have that pick anymore, but I think a lot of the conversation is still pretty relevant to the Blue Jackets at 34th overall. And we talk a little bit about who Sebastian would take at third overall if he was Jarmo Kekalainen. Before we get into that, I want to thank everyone for making this your first listen of the day every day. Locked On Blue Jackets continues to be free and available on all podcast platforms. We're over on YouTube. So if you haven't hit subscribe yet, please feel free to do so. And you can also find us over on Sirius XM, which is really neat. I also have to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the Locked On Podcast Network. Make every moment more and visit fanduel.com/lockedon to get started. And I'll just turn the conversation over to past me and Sebastian because honestly, they are both much smarter than I am right now. I've got Sebastian High here from Dobber Prospect back to talk about a guy that could be available at 22nd, but also could be available for the Blue Jackets maybe a little bit later on. This is another name that I feel like is pretty divisive in terms of where people think he should go. So we're talking about Ethan Gauthier today, who has some again, kind of like Reinbacher, who we talked about in the previous episode, has a lot of fans and has a lot of guys that are, or a lot of prospect guys that are like, maybe not with this guy. So let's kick it off. Let's talk about Ethan Gauthier as a player. What's his best attribute? What's his worst attribute? And kind of what do you get from Ethan Gauthier as a hockey player?
Gauthier is a guy that I can fully understand why so many scouts have just fallen in love with him. He has a tremendous motor. He is a suffocating forechecker, relentless, both offensively and defensively, and that is a basis for a really fun player that a lot of scouts are always looking for. So along the same style of player, a guy that I like a lot more than Gauthier is Gavin Brindley. I'm a massive Gavin Brindley fan.
We love Gavin Brindley on this podcast.
But Ethan Gauthier has a similarly high motor. And I scouted him today in preparation for the podcast, and I bumped him up like 10 spots on my board. So I brought him up to like 40 on my board. But he's been a staple in my second round all year. And I have a few questions in terms of the pure upside. I don't. It's funny that we do both him and Reinbacher at the same time here, because Ethan Gauthier is also a really strong passer, but maybe lacks the playmaking tools to leverage that to a high level in the NHL. When he finds passing lanes, he can hit them beautifully. The issue is creating those chances and creating those openings. And it's kind of a trial and error thing with Gauthier on that front. But at the same time, he's far, far more than just a playmaker. So that's perfectly okay. He is a strong defensive player, consistently engaged. He needs to scan more consistently in his own zone, which he does pretty well offensively, but defensively, that kind of is hit or miss with him. And it means that opponents can kind of just slide into his blind spot and exploit the defensive structure that way. But considering that he's a pretty solid scanner offensively, I think that he can pretty easily develop those habits on the defensive side as well. And he's really well-rounded. He has a pretty good shot, especially on a one-timer. He has an above-average release, and he finds soft ice pretty well. I don't think he's overly dynamic. I think that would be one main limitation in this game. But you're getting a player who's a very, very straightforward bottom six projection with the possibility of leveraging the playmaking or passing game into a higher end playmaking style that could elevate him to a second line role. So you have a basis to develop him. And the fun thing with him is the team that drafts him will have a ton of options of how they really do plan on developing him in the future, because he has this well-rounded game with a couple really high-end tools like his motor and the passing, as I said. But teams could develop him into more of a power forward mold if they want to really encourage him to bulk up, and he'd have to add some balance and refine his puck protection mechanics a bit. But I could see a path for that. Or you could, if you want to, develop him as a goal scorer, because I think his shot and goal scoring instincts are good enough to leverage that. And at the same time, you could develop him as an energy guy, two-way energy winger, or a playmaker. You have a ton of options. So I could see teams being really enticed by him just by his versatility, and it gives them a ton of freedom of, okay, looking at their own draft, like prospect pool, being like, we have a lot of like power forwards and stuff. What we're lacking is like a gritty playmaker. Let's make sure that we like develop Ethan Gauthier in that sense, which in my view would be the best way of developing him to kind of squeeze the most possible value out of him. But there's a lot of options there as a development staff. So I could definitely see teams being really enticed by that in the early 20s. I think he could even go in the teens. I think there's a lot of possible outcomes there. I wouldn't be surprised if he went anywhere between 17 and like 40. I'd be kind of surprised if it fell to the second round, but I think it's thoroughly possible. And the issue with this draft class is that, in my mind, there are about 45 first-round talents. So there's inevitably there's just going to be players that fall to the second round that shouldn't, because there's just too many of them of that caliber. And yeah, so it's a very fun draft class. And 40 on my board feels too low for Gauthier, because I have a ton of respect for the way he plays. I've watched him a lot, considering I also watch a lot of Joshua Roy as a Habs fan. So I've seen him a ton. I saw him a lot in his D-1 year as well, and I liked him a lot then. And he started off the draft like when I started scouting in like October. My first like rough board, he was like around like 22nd on my board, but just consistently fell because other guys leapfrogged him when I saw more of them. So it's not a thing of me having really doubts about his projection. I think he's a pretty safe bet to be an NHLer, and a pretty fun NHLer at that. I think he'll be a fan favorite. It's more of a thing of, how much do you value that middle six projection when there are other players that might still be available that have potential top line upside? Like if you're passing on a player like, I don't know, who's risky but fun, William Whitelaw, far from a slam dunk NHLer, but has ridiculously good tools and really high upside. And so he's a player that I think I would swing on before I would swing on Gauthier, but I can understand why other scouts wouldn't. And in the end, it's all about your own risk assessment and your own risk gauge as a scout, and how you kind of rank that. And I can totally understand going either way on that front.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like the Blue Jackets specifically have been a really interesting team to watch draft over the past couple of years, because their kind of drafting MO seems to be, we're going to take the guys with skills and the guys that can, create these ridiculous, like the chaos of Kent Johnson, and we'll figure the rest out. I think they have a lot of faith in their development program.
Which I
Rick
adore.
Nash is running that at the minute. And, he was, don't know if you've heard of him. He was a pretty good NHL player. I said back in the day, like it wasn't 10 years ago. But so it's been really interesting to watch them draft guys that, do you go high risk, high reward, or do you go for more of a sure thing? And I feel like the Blue Jackets definitely fall into that kind of high risk, high reward drafting strategy. Gauthier is a really interesting one, because I kind of, again, I don't have my own draft board as such, just because I don't have the time to cover an NHL team and also then pay attention to, the 200 to 300.
It's a big time commitment. I speak from experience. So it's a big time commitment.
I don't have my own board as of yet, but I kind of pay attention to the rankings on Elite Prospect, and so they go anywhere from they have him anywhere from 15th to 79th, and that feels like a a huge gap. And is that just because of like Gauthier's kind of polarizing aspect, or is that just because this draft is so deep that like he could fall all the way to the third round? Unlikely, but I feel like stranger things have probably happened.
I wouldn't say that he's overly polarizing. I think it's more of a thing of him being a pretty good litmus test for scouts in terms of what they value, not in terms of ability, just in terms of their own preferences. So I'm a bit lower on Gauthier than my good friend and fellow Dobber prospects, North American director of scouting, Hadi Kalakash. Hadi has him like mid-20s, and I can understand why. And Hadi was our QMJHL scout before he got promoted, so he's watched more of him than anyone else on the team has, and he's quite bullish on Gauthier in the middle of the first round. So I think it just kind of depends on the scouts. I think 79th, like where Smart Scouting has him, that's a bit low, but I love the guys over at Smart Scouting. Like the name is fitting. They're a bunch of pretty smart people, and also just I've always had the best interactions with them, just really nice people. But 79, I think I haven't read their justification for that pick, which I think you kind of have to before judging someone's ranking. But yeah, I think the lowest I'd probably drop Gauthier on my own board in terms of like the range I have him in is like maybe like 55 to 60 range. But yeah, I wouldn't say he's overly polarizing. Like guys like Lucas Dragicevic are super polarizing. Mm-hmm. Same thing with like Edward Shala and even Gabe Perreault. Like you have a lot of polarizing players in this draft class. Andrew Crystal, like there's a lot of guys that are super polarizing. And I think with Gauthier, because he plays that style that every single scout can respect and is fairly projectable to the NHL level, I think he's a pretty safe bet to go top 50. Like, I'd be pretty shocked if he fell below 50.
In a minute, I've got more of my conversation with Sebastian about Ethan Gauthier, but first, I've got to tell you all about FanDuel, because it is America's #1 sportsbook. If you make your way to FanDuel right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. There's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. So if you had put some money on the Florida Panthers winning the Stanley Cup, for example, you would get that money back in bonus bets. Or if you bet on the Vegas Golden Knights, you would have won some money, both of which are equally fun. I think there's no better place to bet all of the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon, get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. Once again, that is FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of the NBA and also us, the Locked On Podcast Network. Yeah, it's always so interesting because I try and talk to as many different prospect guys during this like period of time as I can, because again, I don't know as much as the incredibly smart people that I bring on the show to talk about these things, and it's always so interesting to talk to like 4 or 5 different guys and have them be like, well, I value this in a player, I value this in a player, I think this player is better because X, I think this player is better because Y. It's so as someone again who again kind of exists on the very, very fringes of prospect stuff, it's so interesting to kind of see to get to talk to people and get their understanding behind just kind of reading the Athletics top 100 players and getting like the one paragraph on Will Smith or whoever.
Yeah.
But I want to kind of finish off with talking a little bit about that third overall pick that the Blue Jackets have, because again, I feel like I have seen a lot of people say Will Smith. It's definitely Will Smith. If it's anyone but Will Smith, you fire Jarmo Kekalainen. And I've seen a lot of people saying, okay, the Blue Jackets need centers, but they should go for Michkov because he has the potential to be, as good as Bedard, maybe better. And then I see a third group of people saying, yeah, Leo Carlsson's the guy. I personally fall into that Leo Carlsson school of thought. I like him a lot. I think he fits what the Blue Jackets are building. I think he's an incredibly smart player. Doesn't have as high of a ceiling as Michkov. I don't think he's as flashy as Smith, but he's very quietly very good, I think. Yeah. So I'm gonna turn it over to you. If we just go ahead and assume that the Blackhawks take Bedard first overall, that feels like a pretty safe bet. If we go ahead and assume that the Ducks take Fantilli, even though I'm trying real hard to manifest them taking Michkov so we can have Fantilli.
Yeah, like Carlsson, I think is like a 10% chance for the Anaheim. Like it's probably not going to happen, but I think it's within the realm of slight possibility.
Yeah, I think the gap is closer than a lot of people think. But let's say Bedard and Fantilli are off the board. Who are you taking third overall for the Blue Jackets?
I'd be taking Matvei Michkov, despite Leo Carlsson being stylistically the best fit. Like, I think if you're drafting, I hate saying it, like drafting for need, but I think more just drafting based on your own prospect pool and your own NHL team, Leo Carlsson probably makes the most sense. I don't really understand Will Smith being like this do or die pick at 3. I mean, I have him ranked 7th on my board, I think. I like him a ton. He reminds me a lot of Trevor Zegras in a lot of ways, where, yes, ridiculously flashy. Like, he's super creative. He will try anything. He's confident. He's really fun. And he's a tremendous playmaker with significant goal scoring upside. He's also the least refined of all those players that we're talking about. Like, he's not overly valuable either in transition or defensively. He is, at this point, purely an offensive piece. I think Matvei Michkov is more diverse in terms of his strengths than Will Smith is, which I've always seen as a lot of people criticize Michkov for being one-dimensional, but I think Will Smith is a bit more one-dimensional than Michkov is. Leo Carlsson makes a lot of sense in terms of being a natural center who spent the entire year on the wing, which, I mean, I'm glad we got to see him at the World Championships at center, because it's like, yeah, the guy who looks like a center and plays like a center is a good center. Shocking.
Who could have seen this coming? Yeah.
Yeah, but he'd be a great fit in Columbus, and I would not all be disappointed if as a Columbus fan if you landed him. He is a refined, an intelligent player. He is a power forward and a playmaker, and he's quite creative and calculated. He's very practical in how he uses his skill. Very pro ready. I mean, he played the entire season in one of the top leagues in the world and did pretty well there, both in terms of production and overall play. So that would be a great fit. At the same time, I just wouldn't be able to pass on Michkov's upside. I'm not the only one in that camp. I see Matvei Michkov as, like, yes, you're waiting 3 years, but if you're not picking top 2, you're usually waiting at least 1 or 2 years anyways. So I don't really see why the contract has been blown up into the issue that it has, because I don't really see it as that big of a thing, especially considering that Michkov has personally come out publicly and teammates have come out publicly saying that his dream is to play in the NHL. And I don't really see as big of a risk in terms of, the Russian factor. And especially considering that last year, Russian players didn't at all fall in the draft. Like, you saw, I mean, 2 Russians went in the first round. 3 if you count Mintyukov, but I'm thinking of like Russians that were playing in Russia. And then you also add to that Artyom Duda, who went 34th, which was a reach in terms of ability. And he played for CSKA, which a week prior had barred their goalie from going to North America to play with Philly. So I don't see as many issues around the whole quote unquote Russian factor with Michkov. And I think that his upside is one of a dominant triple threat offensive piece, elite level goal scoring, elite level playmaking, elite level handling. And I just wouldn't be able to rationalize passing on that personally. But I can totally understand why you pick a guy like Carlsson. Like, you're getting a player that could play NHL minutes next year. Not that he necessarily should, but he could. And he's refined. He's a natural center. You're getting a slam dunk high end 2C at the very least. Like, this is like, I probably would have ranked both Carlsson and Michkov over Shane Wright, who was my top player last year. So either way, you're getting a tremendous player, and you really can't complain either way. Will Smith, I think, again, super flashy, and I like him a ton. At 3rd overall is a bit of a reach for me, because I'd like to. It's kind of that application of the tools in terms of practical, I guess, ability. And a lot of it was him trying out things and it not always being the most calculated decision. And you already have Kent Johnson, who is a very, very, very similar mold to Will Smith, albeit typically as a winger. And I think Smith could also be a winger at the NHL level. I don't at all think he's a slam dunk centerman. So I think if you look at the combination of need and upside, I think Carlsson or Michkov are the best candidates in number 3.
Yeah, it's going to be tough watching Michkov go to San Jose if that is the way that it kind of shakes out.
I think he's going to Washington at 8.
You think he falls all the way to 8?
Oh yeah,
Man.
I think he could fall outside the top 10. I think it's more likely he falls outside the top 7 than he goes top 4. But I hope I'm wrong.
It's going to be, I don't know. It's so tough to predict. And I feel like every year there's one team kind of in the top 5 that goes off the board and drafts some random, like I think about Anaheim taking Mason McTavish a couple of years ago at 3 overall, and then that just shaking the rest of the board.
Yeah.
And I think that's why Ken Johnson went as high as 5th. Like looking back in that draft, I'm like, yeah, I would absolutely take Ken Johnson 5th overall.
Yeah.
Now that I, in hindsight, but at the time I was like, okay, this is just because you guys want a center, and I don't necessarily agree with it, but happy to have him on board. And now I'm like, man, I sounded real stupid 2 years ago, So it's going to be interesting. I think if he goes anywhere, I think Arizona is a real possibility to take him. They are in a place where they can wait those 3 years for Alec Michkov. But yeah, I feel like in maybe 5 years, there's going to be a whole bunch of teams watching Matvei Michkov tear the NHL apart and be like, man, we should have taken him 2nd overall.
And when he does come over, he's going to be on a full 3-year ELC. It won't be like Kaprizov with his 1-year ELC. He's going to have a full 3-year deal. And especially if you're starting to contend at that point and you can add a 21-year-old Matvei Michkov for 3 years at under $1 million, I think that's quite enticing personally.
Yeah. It's gonna be really fun to like the NHL. I think in the year 2025, there's a bunch of guys right now that are just on the edge of breaking out, and I think it's gonna be really, really fun. I say that as a person who covers a rebuilding team. Like 2025 for me is when I'm expecting all of our young guys to just kind of pop.
For sure.
It's gonna be a lot of fun. Thank you for coming to hang out.
My pleasure.
About Gauthier. Previously, we talked about Reinbacher. If people want to learn more about kind of the prospect work that you do, if they want to catch up on your draft boards, things like that, where can people find you and your work online?
All my work is pretty centralized on Twitter. So _Sebastian. It's on the screen on YouTube. Everything I do, I kind of post on there. I tweet a bit too much. But yeah, you can find everything I do there. And also go check out Dobber Prospects. We made our final ranking. We had our final ranking meeting a couple days ago, and our top 100 articles should come out within the next 10 or so days. So definitely keep your eye on that so you can see what the entire Dobber team is up to and not just myself. But yeah, I think if you just go follow Dobber Prospects and check out my Twitter account, you can pretty much follow everything I'm doing.
Can confirm Sebastian does tweet a lot, but they're all incredibly good tweets. So
I appreciate that. Thank you.
And that's all I've got for today. Tomorrow, Hayden will be back. We'll be getting back to our regular schedule. You may have noticed I am back in my home studio. So we will be back with regular episodes with both Hayden and I. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about Trey Fix-Wolansky, who is a player that I simply adore. So let's get excited for that. We're going to be doing our season review of him. And then we'll be getting really into the off-season fun, I think. So make sure you stay tuned. You can find me on Twitter at _Jacob Foster, JAKOBFORSTER. You can find the podcast at LO_Blue Jackets. You can find Hayden at HaydenH971 on Twitter. And if you have comments, questions, criticism, you can email us at lockedonbluejackets@gmail.com. Thank you once again for listening, for making us your first listen of the day. Locked on Blue Jackets continues to be free and available on all podcast platforms, on YouTube and on Sirius XM. And until tomorrow, make sure you stay locked on.